Texas is known not only for its endless expanses, unique nature, and hot sun. Sometimes the state becomes the scene of mysterious and inexplicable disappearances that leave many questions and very few answers. Today we continue to tell the stories of people who disappeared right before the eyes of their friends and relatives in well-known and popular places in Texas. October 2004, Big Bend National Park. May 1999, Davis Mountain, and June 1992, Garner Park. What do these cases have in common, other than the fact that people disappeared without a trace? In October 2004, a group of 5 students from the University of Austin decided to spend their vacation in Big Bend National Park, located in southwestern Texas. Known for its majestic canyons, wide desert expanses, and legendary mysterious lights that flicker above the horizon at night, Big Bend often attracts lovers of unusual stories and secluded getaways. The students had long dreamed of spending a few days there, setting up camp, exploring the little-used trails, and of course trying to see for themselves the famous lights that had been the subject of so many rumors. Arriving in 2 cars late in the evening, the guys chose a semi-abandoned parking lot at the foot of a low hill where only a few tourists stopped. The weather was cool, as it was already October and the sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades. When they set up their tent and lit a modest campfire, one of them, 20-year-old Robert Hayes, said he dreamed of seeing one of those mysterious lights. The others just shrugged. Why would they suddenly appear today? But Robert was burning with enthusiasm. On the very first night, as everyone sat around the campfire chatting leisurely and preparing dinner, a glow suddenly appeared on the top of a nearby hill, like a translucent ball of light, flickering slightly. It instantly caught the attention of the whole group. No one expected the legend to appear so close to them. The light was not very bright, but clear enough to cause general surprise. For a second, everyone sat in silent confusion. Then Robert jumped up, grabbed a flashlight, and commanded, "Guys, I'm going to check what it is." His friends tried to dissuade him. "Wait. Let's go in the morning. It's dark now." But he was too excited. In the end, no one actively tried to stop him. Robert left quickly and disappeared from view behind the nighttime bushes. The other kids, Sarah, Miguel, Joan, and Pete, only saw him climbing upward, heading in the direction of the light. According to Sarah, the fire burned steadily, then flared up and dimmed, and suddenly Robert was at the top. We could see his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He stopped, as if looking somewhere to the side. And then the light went out. Perhaps it faded in a split second, and with it, Robert disappeared. His friends could no longer see his shadow or movement. Miguel called out, "Hey Robert, are you okay?" There was no response. Deciding that the guy had just gotten carried away or tripped, they waited a couple of minutes and called again. No one came out from behind the hill. Then they grabbed their flashlights and climbed to the top together. But after a few minutes, they realized he wasn't there. That night, the friends searched the surrounding area. The hill wasn't particularly steep. The top was visible, and there were only small bushes around it. Finding a person who had simply fallen would not have been difficult, but there was no sign of anyone there. They called out again and again, "Robert, answer!" But the only response was silence, interrupted by the night wind. There were no signs of a struggle, no items belonging to the guy on the ground. Everything was clean. Finally, when it became clear that the situation was serious, Miguel went to the car and drove to the nearest ranger station. There aren't many of these stations in Big Bend, but eventually, closer to midnight, 2 park employees arrived at the scene. They searched the area with flashlights, tried to call out to Robert, and asked the guys to describe what they had seen, but to no avail. In the morning, when dawn broke, an additional team of volunteers and rangers was organized in the park to begin a systematic search. For 2 days, people combed the area around the hill, went down to the bed of a dry stream, entered sparse groves, and searched rocky ledges. Big Bend is not as dense as a forest, but rocks and desert areas can hide ravines and crevices. However, there was no sign of Robert Hayes. No footprints, no clothes, no backpack. He had a small backpack that he had put on before climbing. The dogs brought in on the third day ran around nervously, occasionally picking up a scent near the camp, but then losing it at the foot of the hill. What was surprising was that the area around the hill was quite open, hills with relatively sparse vegetation, and if a person had simply been wandering around there, they would probably have been easily spotted from the nearest hills, but it was all in vain. Robert's sister, who arrived a couple of days later from Austin, cried over the unimaginable. How was it possible that in a single minute, a man who had been visible at the top of the hill had disappeared without a trace, without a sound or a commotion? While the rescuers racked their brains, the days passed, and not the slightest clue appeared. Then a week later, local tourists walking 1.5 miles northwest of the camp stumbled upon Robert's diary on the top of a sheer cliff. It was a bound notebook that he often carried with him for notes and sketches. It was amazing that the place where it was found was considered virtually inaccessible without rock climbing skills. Special equipment was needed to climb up there, and there was no official trail leading to it. The diary lay neatly, as if it had been placed there on purpose on a flat ledge. The ledge itself was only a few feet wide. The rangers who arrived at the scene risked climbing up with ropes and confirmed that the diary did indeed belong to the missing man. There were no traces of Robert himself or any other belongings on the ledge. A thorough examination of the notebook revealed no recent entries. The pages appeared to end with notes about travel plans. There were no references to a strange light or anything similar. This discovery further baffled everyone involved in the search. How could the diary have ended up on a hard-to-reach cliff, several miles from the place of disappearance? And most importantly, how could Robert himself have gotten there? Even if he had, he would hardly have left his diary there and gone off somewhere else. Clearly, something completely inexplicable had happened. However, the police filed a dry report. The notebook has been confirmed as belonging to the missing person based on the notes. Its further whereabouts are unknown. No further leads emerged in the investigation. Rumors circulated that someone had deliberately planted the diary, or that Robert himself had left it there as a mark, but nothing in the diary indicated such intentions. The accident theory, although logical, was difficult to take seriously. Why would he climb such a rock, alone and without equipment? There was no evidence to support the crime theory either. No crimes had been reported in the park during that period, and there were no signs of a struggle at the campsite. His friends insisted that he disappeared at the exact moment the lights went out, either a coincidence or something inexplicable. Some mentioned the mystical lights of Big Ben, which, according to local legends, sometimes appear at night and lead people astray. But this happened on the very first evening when the group had not yet had time to settle in. Thus, years later, the disappearance of 20-year-old Robert Hayes in October 2004 and the subsequent strange discovery of his diary on an inaccessible cliff became one of the local mysteries. His family came to terms with the fact that their son was probably no longer alive, as no news had surfaced. The county police closed the active phase of the investigation, recording him as missing under unknown circumstances. Many questions remained unanswered. Where did the guy disappear to? Who was seen on the summit one second and then the next? How did the diary end up in a place that cannot be reached without climbing skills? And what was the mysterious light above the hill? In May 1999, 35-year-old nature photographer Edward Brooks set out for Davis Mountain, the highest point in Texas, to take some unique pictures of the sunset. Known among landscape photographers for his persistence and talent for finding unusual angles, he loved to work alone. He said that solitude allowed him to focus on nature. Those who knew him were not surprised by his desire to go there alone. Although the Davis Mountains are not known for being extremely dangerous, they do require caution due to steep climbs and gusty winds. Edward himself planned to take a series of photographs of the sunset sky, spend the night in a camp at the foot of the mountain, and return to civilization the next day. Judging by the notes in his notebook, which were later found in his car, Edward planned to climb to the summit during the day, catch the golden hour of the evening sun, and descend before nightfall. The weather that day was clear, relatively warm, with no storm warnings. Everything looked safe. No one expected any trouble, as he had been to the Davis Mountains before and knew the trails. When he did not return to his car in the parking lot on Sunday, May 16th, volunteer friends who were also in the mountain area became concerned. Edward's belongings were in the trunk, a supply of food, warm clothes. He had taken only his main camera equipment and a light backpack. Climbing the trail to the summit, the volunteers did not find him along the way or at key vantage points. On the way, they met other tourists who remembered seeing a lonely man with a large camera closer to lunchtime. He was walking briskly and greeting people politely. No one noticed any signs of distress or problems. By evening, rangers arrived at the site and began sending out requests via radio to other tourists. "Has anyone seen a photographer with a backpack?" Nothing. The next morning, the search operation was expanded. Several groups searched the intermediate stops and trails, and dog handlers were called in, but the dogs were unable to pick up his trail near the summit. Perhaps the wind and rocky ground had left no scent. The area around Mount Davis is fairly open with rocky cliffs but also some gentle slopes. The rangers said, "If he slipped and fell, we would have found clues, pieces of clothing, the camera must have broken, something," but the search yielded nothing. On the second day of the search, as the helicopter circled the summit, the pilot noticed something shiny in the distance at the very edge of the stone plateau. A couple of rescuers landed and examined the spot. It turned out to be a backpack and a camera lying on a flat ledge next to a small crevice, but there was no sign of Edward, his clothes, or any traces of a struggle or blood. Inside the backpack were additional lenses, spare film, a notebook with brief notes on light and exposure, but no mention of what might have happened. It seemed as if Edward himself had laid the items out neatly, or if they had been carefully arranged. The lens cap lay on a rock nearby, as if it had been removed in a hurry. The camera found next to the backpack contained a roll of film. More precisely, it was on the last frame, the empty film already rewound. In the dark room where the rescuers took the camera, they carefully removed the film. Amazingly, all the previous frames captured fragmentary views of Mount Davis, breathtaking landscapes, sunset, a deserted plain below, but the last frame showed an almost unrecognizable, frightened look. It was Edward's face, as if he had turned the camera around and pressed the shutter. And at that moment, the frame came out blurred, but his wide eyes and contorted fear were clearly visible, plus something vague behind him out of focus. It looked as if he was trying to capture something behind him, but in the end, the lens captured him in motion. Neither the cause of the fear nor anything specific behind him could be discerned, only blurred outlines resembling rock ledges or shadows. This discovery clearly suggested that something had happened to him at the last moment. The police could not say anything more. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing. There were no notes on the rock ledge indicating where he might have gone. The search continued in the following days, with the area around the summit and crevices being thoroughly searched. Divers even checked nearby bodies of water, although there was little chance that he had fallen in, all to no avail. The wind and sun quickly erased any possible clues, and the terrain could have hidden small crevices in the steep cliffs. Rangers talking to journalists said that this was one of the strangest episodes. Usually, if a person falls, there are traces of the fall, some fragments of equipment, blood, and sooner or later the body is found. But here, the summit of Davis Mountain is quite popular, and after a week of searching, nothing but the camera surfaced. Edward's relatives were shocked when they learned about the last photo. His face remained on the negative. The police said that it was impossible to determine what caused the fear, and it was unclear whether there was someone or something standing there. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Upon careful examination of the negatives, experts noticed that the blurred background could have been a shadow from a rock or a cloud. It was difficult to say. Some members of the community, fascinated by the topic of mystical disappearances, cited this photograph as an example of a ghostly or anomalous phenomenon. But rational researchers pointed out that Edward could have simply stumbled, been frightened by a snake or the wind, accidentally pressed the shutter button, and fallen down. However, in more than 25 years, the body has not been found. In short, the outcome was sad. Edward Brooks never returned, and the presumed cause of his disappearance has not been established. The case was officially classified as missing under unclear circumstances with no suspicion of foul play. To those around him, it seemed strange. He was an experienced hiker, knew the Davis Mountains well, had made many trips to other parks, and was not known for recklessness. If he had fallen, it would probably have been possible to trace his fall, and if he had gone and got lost, he could have sent a signal. But everything indicates that it was at the summit that he encountered something that caused him sudden terror, and then he disappeared. Richard Holt, a 27-year-old resident of San Antonio, went to Garner State Park on June 11, 1992, with two friends, Tom and Greg. The park is known in Texas for its picturesque hills, oak and cedar forests, and the clear Rio Frio River, which winds through winding canyons. On that day, the group planned an easy hike to get away from the city noise and enjoy the summer scenery. According to Tom, the weather was absolutely clear with no sign of rain, and the temperature was around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. They arrived early in the morning, left their car in the parking lot at the entrance, and set off on the official trail that runs along the creek, where people usually stop to admire the water or take a dip. By noon, a little tired from climbing the rocky hills, the friends decided to take a break by the creek flowing through the rocky bed. The landscape was magnificent: hills, cedar thickets, and a rocky ridge rising nearby, which tourists love to photograph. Richard took out some sandwiches and suggested they have a snack, then said he would like to go and look at that rock up there. Greg asked if he was too tired, but Richard just smiled. "I'm fine. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I'll take a couple of pictures." When Richard had walked a few hundred feet up the trail, Tom and Greg stayed below, finishing their sandwiches and enjoying the view of the water rushing over the shallow rapids. Suddenly they heard a strange sound. Greg described it as a muffled cry, or perhaps a call coming from the direction Richard had gone. The sound was quick and sharp, followed by a deathly silence. Both friends became alarmed, suspecting that Richard might have fallen or suddenly been frightened by something. They called out his name, but there was no answer. Disturbed, the friends left their backpacks and followed the trail upward. Surprisingly, after a short climb of a few minutes, they couldn't find Richard. The trail ran along a slightly elevated slope without dense forest, and the area seemed relatively open. Practically a view in all directions, nowhere to hide, Greg recalled later. However, they saw no one, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Climbing up to the rock that Richard wanted to see, they called out again and walked a little further behind the ledge. Nothing. It seemed there was nowhere to disappear. There was no steep cliff to fall off, and the river remained below. At first, his friends thought he was joking, hiding behind a bush, but 10 minutes passed, then 15. Nothing. Realizing that this was no joke, Tom and Greg climbed back down to the stream where they had left their backpacks, hoping that Richard had returned, but he wasn't there. They hurried to the nearest area where they had seen other tourists and asked for help. At around 3 p.m. that same day, an alarm was raised in the park. One of the rangers arrived at the scene, listened to the story, and invited a group of volunteers to conduct an initial search of the area. What could have happened in the middle of a clear, bright day, especially in an open area? Everything pointed to Richard disappearing from view in literally a minute. By evening, sheriff's deputies arrived to officially report the disappearance. A crowd of nearly 24 people gathered: park employees, volunteers, tourists. They split into groups and searched the ridge, the same rocky outcrops and bushes. Soon, a couple of dog handlers with dogs were called to the scene, but they were unable to arrive until nightfall. But there were no results. The dogs sniffed Richard's scent on his belongings in the car, followed the trail to where the men had eaten lunch, picked up the scent on the trail, and, according to the dog handlers, lost it literally 7,100 feet after the ascent. It was as if he had vanished at the point where he was last seen. In the days that followed, the search operation expanded. Even a small group of rescuers with a helicopter joined in, flying over the peaks and ravines. Garner is a fairly popular park, and such a disappearance caused quite a stir among the locals. It seemed that all they had to do was look closely at the slope, and they would find some kind of trace, clothing, a camera, or signs that he had slipped. But nothing was found. Days passed and the heat remained. Experts said that if Richard had lost consciousness somewhere, sooner or later he would be found, or he would respond to cries for help. But there was no response. On the 5th day of the search, when the enthusiasm of the participants was waning, only a couple of oddities were discovered. One tourist, who was walking in a remote part of the park at the time, claimed to have seen a man resembling Richard, dressed in a white t-shirt and dark shorts, walking down a rocky ravine closer to sunset on the first day of his disappearance. But this witness could not clearly identify the man's face. The area where he allegedly saw the figure was searched, but again, without result. No one else reported anything similar. A week later, the authorities officially announced that they saw no prospects for a large-scale search. The chances of finding Richard alive were dwindling with each passing day. Friends and relatives continued their private search for some time, but to no avail. No clothing, no backpack, no map, no wallet. It was as if everything he had with him had been left in the car. The police questioned Tom and Greg about possible conflicts, wondering if Richard had a reason to disappear. Both swore that he loved life and had no debts. He had simply walked away to look at the cliff and disappeared. Many years have passed since then. For the local police, this is one of those unsolved cases where a missing person apparently disappeared in open terrain on a clear day, and no reasonable explanation has been found. In the end, the official reports were closed with the wording, "Missing, cause unknown." According to rangers, neither wolves nor cougars attack people in that area. However, large predators often leave clues behind. Scraps of clothing, blood. Was it a crime? No one saw any suspicious individuals. He couldn't have fallen into a ravine. There are no deep cliffs there. His relatives continued to live without a body to bury, and without knowing what happened on June 11, 1992, on the sunny slope of the Pinnacles Trail. All 3 cases remain unsolved. The police, rescue workers, and families of the missing have been trying to find answers for many years, but to no avail. Could these incidents be just tragic coincidences, or is there something more to them? What really happened to Robert, Edward, and Richard in places where it would seem impossible to disappear? If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and share your theories in the comments. Perhaps your guess will help solve these mysterious disappearances. Thank you for joining us. Take care and be careful when venturing into the wild corners of our amazing and sometimes mysterious world.